everybody. On behalf of the Highland Park Public Library, we'd like to welcome you to Library in Your Living Room. We are pleased to present Shelf Isolation, a weekly mini-series about books, culture, and what to read next. I'm Sarah, and this is your Information and Reader Services Department. In this episode, we are excited to share with you what we have been reading, watching, and or listening to during self-isolation. To begin our mini-series, I'm going to turn things over to Readers Roundtable expert and moderator, Michelle.
Thanks, Sarah. So this week, I started and completed the fantastic book, The Lost Man by Jane Harper. Brothers Nathan and Bob Bright meet for the first time in months at the remote fence line surrounding their cattle ranches in the lonely outback. Their third brother, Cameron, lies dead at their feet. In an isolated belt of Australia, their homes a 3-hour drive apart, the brothers were one another's nearest neighbors. Cameron was the middle child, the one who ran the family homestead, but something made him head out alone under the unrelenting sun. Nathan, Bub, and Nathan's son returned to Cameron's ranch, and to those left behind by his passing, his wife, his daughters, and his mother, as well as their longtime employer and 2 recent hired seasonal workers. While they grieve Cameron's loss, suspicion starts to take hold, and Nathan is forced to examine secrets the family would rather leave in the past. Because if someone forced Cameron to his death, the isolation of the outback leaves few suspects. This was a great book. It's actually my second that I've read by Jane Harper. She's fantastic. And the narrator of the audiobook, his name is Stephen Shanahan. He is great. He actually read all 3 of her books. She's very well known for her first book, The Dry, which I very much loved. If you haven't picked her up, she's just a really fantastic author from the desolate, hot feeling of the outback, but also all of her characters are just really great and very dimensional, and you feel many things for all of them. They all have their own feelings, they have their own everything going on, and it's just fantastic. And this is another great book. This one is actually a standalone, and I do highly recommend this one. That's everything that I have to talk about today, so I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, of course, I read mysteries again, and this week I read Perfect Little Children by Sophie Hannah. If you haven't read any of her books, she's written a lot of, followed up with the Agatha Christie estate and has written a lot of her standalone mysteries. But this one is about 4 friends. They were friends before they had children. It's Beth and Dom and Lewis and Flora Braid. And one day, Beth is driving her son to a soccer game, and she happens to be through the town where the Braids now live. Now, the Braids she hasn't seen in 12 years because there's a falling out that takes place. You don't know for quite some time what happened, but as she's driving by, she drops her son off at his game, and then she tells him she's going to go get some groceries, but instead she goes and she sits outside the house of Flora Braid, and she just happens to see Flora getting out of her car. And again, she hasn't seen them in 12 years, and the last time she saw them, the Braids had children that were 5 and 3. So she's sitting there in her car, and all of a sudden Flora gets out and she hears Flora call Thomas and Emily, and that's the name of the 2 children that she knows. Well, these children get out and they're still 5 and 3. So she's like, what is going on? These are the same kids. I know it is. It's the same name and stuff. And she's just like, you know, what has happened? What have I missed out on? So she becomes obsessed about it. So she tells her husband, you know, he tells her, oh, you know, you just saw, you know, I'm sure they were kids that maybe she has 2 new children and they just look like them. And she's like, no, they called them the same names and everything. So the story goes on, and Beth keeps digging and digging and digging. And at first Lewis calls, and he says that they live in Florida now, that there's no way that she saw Flora because they've been in Florida for quite some time. But Beth doesn't believe him. So then she goes on Instagram, voila, and she sees the photos of Lewis with Emily and Thomas, who are the correct ages in these photos. But then she runs into Flora still in London, not in Florida like Lewis has told her. And when Flora sees her, she tears off and runs the opposite direction. So now she's really, really, really like, what the heck is going on? And more twists and turns happen, and she ends up in Florida confronting Lewis and Flora. And I tell you, things take quite the turns. It's an excellent, excellent story. It ended I did not see the ending coming at all. It was just a great book. and I highly recommend it. Again, it's Perfect Little Children by Sophie Hannah. And then the next book I read was The Family Upstairs, and it's by Lisa Jewell. And there is a family upstairs. But actually, it was really an interesting story. So the story is told by three narrators. You have Libby, who is this young 26-year-old girl who she knows something, she's adopted, and she knows something big is going to happen on her 26th birthday. Then there's Lucy, and then there's the male narrator, and you don't quite know who it is until later in the story. But anyway, so on her 26th birthday, she gets this letter in the mail, and it tells her that she's inherited this house. She's hoping to find out who her real parents were. So she inherits this home on Cheney Drive, and it's in Chelsea. So it's this multi-million-dollar place. It hasn't been opened in years, actually in 26 years. She finds out that actually she was a baby found in the house, and that there were three adults downstairs that were dead, and they believe that it was a cult because they're all in black clothing and they're laying on the floor in the kitchen. She finds out that her name isn't Libby, but it was Serenity Lamb. And then while this is happening, then the other story goes to Lucy. You don't know which girl she is in the house because all the kids disappeared. All they found were these three adults. They hadn't seen the children in years, but they know that there were 4 children there at one time. No one knows where they are. And the other weird thing is, like, no one had any shoes. That was the other interesting thing. Anyway, the story goes back and forth. Like I said, Libby telling her part. Then there's Lucy telling her she lives in France. And then all of a sudden on her cell phone, it pops up, the baby is 26. So you're like going, what does that mean to her? Then there's the guy telling his story, and he's talking about what happened in the house before the deaths that took place. So it was really good. I highly recommend that one too. It had a really interesting ending, which I think could probably set up with another story. The kind of the way they left it was a really, really good mystery. And I hate to tell you, Gus, there was still no cowboy in the story. So someday I will find one of those. I will share that with everyone. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Gus.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's disappointing there's no cowboy, but you know what? I'm really hoping for the next one. Cowboy, millionaire, or billionaire. On that note, I've just been reading one book this week. It is written by the person who wrote the scariest book of all time, The Exorcist. If you guys have read it, that book is extremely scary. It's not scary. Scary is, okay, oh, wow, that's scary. This is really scary. But a little fun fact, it is William Peter Blatty, and he wrote The Exorcist, but that's not what I'm reading. I am reading a book he came out with called Finding Peter. And the interesting thing about this one is it's not scary, and he was actually not known for doing scary work. He did a lot of comedies before he did The Exorcist, which turned out to be beyond freaky. So if you guys, I don't know, it's very scary. But this book is about, I think he had like 7 kids, and one of his sons passed away by a rare like heart disorder. And the book is about his son Peter and how great of a kid he was. It's a sad book, but it's going to make you laugh too. There's comedy in it. It's kind of a memoir of his son and how after he passed away, how him and his wife would have, like, I don't want to say visions, but they would know his presence was there. The title is called Evidence, the True Story of the Hand of Providence and the Evidence of Life After Death. That's kind of the subtitle of this one, like proof that he's still living on somewhere. But it's a very interesting book. He does talk about The Exorcist in it too, so you can skip those chapters if you need to. But if you really want to figure yourself out, read Legion. It's the same author, William Peter Blatty, which is like a sequel to The Exorcist. That one's scary too. So that's what I've been reading this week. And also I'd like to recommend a movie, and this one is scary. It is none other than Halloween. That is the mask of William Shatner. For those that you did not know that. I didn't know that till not, too long ago. So that's William Shatner right there. But anyway, it stars Jamie Lee Curtis, and she has a psycho crazy killer brother who has escaped a mental hospital. Came out in 1978. rated R, so be careful. But this is a classic film. For those of you who haven't seen it, please watch it. If you want to get very scared, check it out. One of the top 10 horror films of all time, directed by John Carpenter, and it's a great time to revisit it. So, Will, I know maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. All right, but yeah, that's what I've been doing this week. So, on that note, I will go ahead and give it to Karen.
Okay, thank you, Gus. More mysteries here. I read 60% of a book called The Cuckoo's Calling by Robert Galbraith, which is a pseudonym of J.K. Rowling. And I was already a fan of hers. I read at least half of the Harry Potter series, and I especially liked her first book for adults, which was called A Casual Vacancy, and not a series book. I expected to like The Cuckoo's Calling, and I thought at the time I began that it was a part of a trilogy. I may have mentioned last time that I started to read this a few years back. Well, at that time, I guess there was a trilogy of books. Now the fifth one has come out, and according to Wikipedia, J.K. Rowling has another 10 of these planned. I think it's at least 10 more. So I hope I continue to like this, because I would have a long series of books to read ahead of me. It took me a while to get into this. I wasn't that interested in the mystery part of it, the murder, or was it a murder? It might have been a suicide. The victim is a young supermodel. She maybe fell out of a third-story window. Maybe she was pushed. The police concluded it was suicide, but one of her family members has hired Cormorant Strike to investigate and see if there's anything the police overlooked. So main character is Cormorant Strike, the private detective, and his office temp, who becomes his sidekick, whose name is Robin. And once they got to working on clues, the book got a lot better, I thought. And I'm enjoying seeing the relationship between those two characters develop. The crime is just, for some reason, not as compelling as the people trying to solve it. And I gather this is I think a TV series in England. The two main characters' photos are on the book covers, and I think there's going to be more of a relationship developing in later books, maybe a romantic one. They seem to be an odd couple at first, but Robin turns out to have a real talent for detective work, and so she's really been an asset so far. So 60% according to my Kindle. And also, I had an interesting thing happen at the library this week. I was at the desk one evening last week, and a woman came in and asked for a recommendation, and she said she generally liked books that were set in foreign countries. And I said, do you like mysteries? Have you heard of Fred Vargas? Oh, yes. And to my surprise, she had read one of his books. Fred is a woman. Actually, Fred Vargas is a pseudonym for a woman. So she had read a Fred Vargas book in a French class she's taking at New Trier Extension. And you probably have heard of New Trier Extension. It's like an community adult education program in the north suburbs, several locations. But they do a lot with languages, and they must have 5 or so levels of French. And I would think this would need a very advanced knowledge of French to read a book like this in the original language. But anyway, so she's heard of Fred Vargas, and I said, you should read more if you can. Because if you remember, I talked about these during the beginning of Shelf Isolation. I was reading one of her series, her longer series then. So that was exciting. So next we will hear from Jackie.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I had a slow reading week this week. I'm not sure really why, but it was. But I did read One by One by Ruth Ware. This is her most recent book, and it is probably a tribute to Agatha Christie, and Then There Were None. So this book takes place in a very remote French resort in the French Alps. It is in a chalet that has rented out by a lot of different people and companies. And it happens to be a company retreat for this week. And it is a company called Snoop, where they are a social media company that created an app where you can snoop on the people you follow. So if someone's online and listening to music, you can listen to the exact same music they're listening to, which seems kind of a weird social media thing, but we know how things are in the world. Everybody loves knowing what everybody else is doing. So the company's at a crossroads. They've got an offer to buy out, and some of the 5 shareholders want to be bought out. Or they can try to borrow more money and take the company public, which some of the other people who are shareholders want to do. So as they're grappling with, what do they want to do? They had a nice skiing day, and when they went back to the chalet, one person didn't make it back, and shortly after the others were all there, an avalanche came and isolated the chalet. Then it became kind of interesting because they're not sure if the person just got lost in the avalanche or possibly was murdered. So the people in the company, there were 9 other people waiting, and then 2 employees at the chalet, Aaron and Danny, who was the chef, are isolated, power's out. There's no cell phone service. There's no phone service. One person was able to get through and talk to the police, but he wasn't sure how well the police can hear him. And then someone else was murdered. And then paranoia set in. And did he really talk to the police? What's really going on? So it's a very interesting story, very fast-paced, very intense, because what's going to happen next was it. The story is told through Liz, who worked with the company originally, but hasn't worked in the company for the last couple of years. But she holds the controlling shares to decide what they're going to do. And Erin, who is the hostess of the chalet, and she has an interesting backstory herself, because there's something in her background that may create some issues. So One by One by Ruth Ware is a very exciting book. All of Ruth Ware's books are very intense to me. I always get really hyped up with what's going to happen. And yes, I was staying up until midnight last night trying to finish it. So I highly recommend this one. So that's pretty much all I read this week. But I did want to mention that for those of you who maybe saw the Office, the American version of The Office, I've seen spotty shows throughout the years, but I never saw the whole season. So I've been watching it. I'm on the last season. And it's really interesting because I would see an episode and say, oh, that explains why they did whatever. So that's been my amusing thing that I've been doing, watching The Office. So that's my week, and I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you, Jackie. Not surprising this week, I've been working to make more Ravinia materials available online, and I just didn't think to do that. And one of the things I found was it's an article or a paper was written by a high school student in Highland Park in 1978, and putting something into an archives and having it put online for everybody to read is different things. So I thought, well, who is this young man who wrote this article in 78? It's really very good. So I looked him up on another one of the library resources, Reference USA, and there's a Bennett Singer writer in New York. I called him up and said what we were doing, and he hasn't lived in Highland Park for years, but he said, sure, put it online. So I think it's great that this young man wrote this, for high school, excellent research paper about Ravinia, and now he's given us permission to put it online in the Digital Library of America, even though he's now a more advanced writer. Pretty happy to share with that, and I don't think it's on the DPLA, it's just on the Illinois Digital Archive, because that has to be indexed and caught up and various other things with that. So also this week, a researcher mentioned to me that she was struggling to come in and only spent 45 minutes working on a project, which is the limit right now. And so I do want to remind everyone that we have a lot of resources online that have been digitized, collections, for example, the Women's Club, thousands of photographs, glass slides, and again, kind of go back to Ravinia, as many people know, there were 2 railways, not just Metra, which there was an electric railway that ran more or less parallel from Chicago to Milwaukee. It's now the bike path. And they opened Ravinia to promote ridership. And we have some wonderful pictures of that electric railway from glass slides that are digitized as well that are also online that people can do. But we have not the whole collection. And there's some things that may never be digitized. But we have many resources for many research projects that are available online, glass slides and others. And I'm kind of like a last minute add-on. I'm in the middle of a book, I haven't finished, but when Karen was talking about the mystery about did she jump or was she pushed, it made me think of an album, one of my favorite albums. It's available on Hoopla. It's actually the last album of the folk singing couple, Richard and Linda Thompson. And the title of the song is Did She Jump or Was She Pushed? And not surprisingly, that was their last album together and their last two together. And it's a really great folk album that I've checked out from Hoopla through the library and many times. With that, I will hand it off to Sarah.
Thanks, Nancy. I will start off this week with a recommendation from my 2-year-old. He turned 2. This is 5 Trucks by Brian Flocka. We read this twice just this morning. And it's very simple. It's just 5 trucks at an airport that go load up an airplane and get it ready to take off. But it's got great illustrations with a lot of detail. And what I really like, I don't know if I can show this, but until you get almost to the end of the book, you just see like a little bit of a plane in different shots, right? You're figuring out that it's an airplane. Anyway, my 2-year-old really likes this. Brian Flocka also has a great book about trains called Locomotive. I tried to read that with him. It is too long for a 2-year-old, but also a great book. But what I've been reading this week to a romance novel called The Boyfriend Project. It's by Farah Roshan, and it starts off, she's getting ready to go on a date with her boyfriend when her sister sees this horrible date gone wrong on Twitter happening live. The woman on this date is live tweeting it, and this main character, Samaya, realizes that this is her boyfriend on this date. And another woman realizes that at the same time, and all 3 of them show up at the restaurant to confront him. And I'm pretty sure that this is going to lead to 2 more books about the 2 other women, but this is the only one so far. At the same time, she's working for this Silicon Valley-esque tech company. It's in Austin, not in Silicon Valley, but that kind of app. The love interest has come to investigate this company because he thinks there's some money laundering going on. So he's undercover. So there are a whole lot of reasons that they should not be dating each other because they're coworkers. She promised these 2 other women she wasn't going to date, but they're just instantly attracted to each other, and there's a lot of witty banter. I've recommended a couple Jasmine Guillory books here before. This would be a great read-alike if you've read all of hers and are waiting for her to write more. So that is The Boyfriend Project by Farah Roshan. And then the third thing I wanted to recommend this week, I've mentioned before, my husband and I have been listening to audiobooks while we walk with our toddler in the stroller every day. And we're now listening to Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I'd only seen the movie. He's actually read the book before, but the audiobook is great. It's narrated by Will Wheaton. And I think this book has gotten enough buzz over the years, and there's a movie, so I don't need to go into the plot. But I wanted to recommend, if you really liked Ready Player One, Ready Player Two comes out next month, and they've announced that the audiobook will also be read by Will Wheaton again, for the Star Trek fans out there. And we have the book and the book on CD on order. We don't have the ebook or e-audio on order yet, but I'm sure we will pretty soon. So if you're excited for those, go ahead and put them on hold. It comes out, I believe, November 24th. So that's it for me, and I will pass it on to Catherine.
Thank you, Sarah. The book that I listened to this week is a collection of short stories. It's called Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick, Stories from the Harlem Renaissance by Zora Neale Hurston. So it is a pretty new book, but of course the short stories are not new because Zora Neale Hurston actually wrote them in the Harlem Renaissance. She's the author who's best known for Their Eyes Are Watching God. And she started writing short stories in 1925 when she was the only Black student at Barnard. The stories are mostly about ordinary people. Some of the stories are funny, some are sad. A lot of the stories are about women who are having problems with men who are troublesome or just no good. But one story that I liked a lot was about a young waitress who's sort of fresh off the farm, comes to the city, she's working, and then this ne'er-do-well type guy from around town takes an interest in her. But because of that, he really tries to better himself. But the way that it all happens is kind of bittersweet, and you don't know exactly how happy you are about how things turn out. So I really like the layers and the nuances. But the thing I wanted to make a point to mention is that I listened to the audiobook of this, and the narrator, Anjanou Ellis, is just top notch. She did such a fantastic job with this. I love the way that she brought life to all the characters. Zora Neale Hurston, the way she writes, I mean, she gave Ellis a lot to work with, but I just thought that Anjanou Ellis's narration was so good. The way she dealt with all the characters' different dialects, with their emotion. This was really just a joy to listen to. The only little drawback I thought was that some of the later stories are a little repetitive because they're stories that Zora Neale Hurston sort of wrote and then reworked again. So it is interesting to see how she did different things with the same material. But on the other hand, when I was just like on the treadmill at the gym, I thought, let's move on to a new thing here. But overall, I would say this is a really great collection, and I definitely recommend that you listen to it in audio. And that's all I have today, so I will pass it to William.
Thank you, Catherine. This past week saw the passing of Bob Gibson, one of the greatest pitchers of all time. I mean, he had a 1.12 ERA in the live ball era. In a sport where stories make up the most interesting part of the game, Gibson had few peers. I had two favorites. The first took place during his playing days and is notable enough to be found on his Wikipedia page, from ex-Cubs and current Astros manager Dusty Baker. Hank Aaron told me, "Don't dig in against Bob Gibson. He'll knock you down. He'd knock down his own grandmother if she dared challenge him. Don't stare at him. Don't smile at him. Don't talk to him. He doesn't like it. If you happen to hit a home run, don't run too slow. Don't run too fast. If you happen to want to celebrate, get in the tunnel first. And if he hits you, don't charge the mound because he's a Gold Glove boxer." I'm like, damn, what about my 17-game hitting streak? That was the night it ended. The second story took place after his career ended. In 1992, at an old-timers game as part of the All-Star Game festivities, Hall of Fame slugger Reggie Jackson hit a home run off Gibson. When the 1993 edition of the game was played, the 57-year-old Gibson threw the 47-year-old Jackson a brushback pitch. The pitch was not especially fast, and it did not hit Jackson, but the message was delivered, and Jackson did not get a hit. Now, while trying to find the exacts behind the story in the latter anecdote, I discovered that this, in fact, wasn't the end of the relationship between Gibson and Jackson. In fact, they went on to write a book together. 60 feet 6 inches, which is the distance between the pitcher's mound and the home plate, is a conversation between the two talking about the game as they knew it, detailing the process and philosophy that resulted in two Hall of Fame careers. Because of the way the book's framed, it really does feel like you're sitting in the room while these two giants of the game shoot the breeze about the game of baseball, talking about everything from the philosophy of what Gibson was looking for from the strike zone to Jackson's true belief that the entire game was meant for him when he got into the batter's box, and the kind of like how that drove all of his strategy behind what he did. Even more impressive, we actually have a copy of this in the library. Well, that's not 100% true. I have the copy of it from the library, but you can get a copy from one of our reciprocal partners and or the digital copy, which we also have. And that's about all I have for the week. I will send it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Will. And that's it for today, folks. As always, please remember that we are all here for you. We are available for comments, questions, or concerns that you might have. And you can reach us online through Facebook at facebook.com/HPLibrary, through our Twitter, which is @HPLibrary, or via email at hppla@hplibrary.org. Because the library's hours and services can change suddenly due to COVID, it is best to contact us via email or via chat on our website before coming to the library. Our music today was Carefree by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find more information about this and the titles we mentioned in our show notes below. Okay, everybody, this is us signing off. Until next time, stay safe.